Stopping sexual violence through non-criminalized community defense and building a culture of consent. We're taught to think about sexual violence as an interpersonal, not a political problem. But sexual violence is more often about power than it is about sex. Sexual violence is political violence, and it very much serves a purpose for the capitalist state. It happens everywhere, in our homes, workplaces, schools, places of worship, hospitals, and beyond. And while women, trans and cis, and children are the most frequently impacted, sexual violence impacts all genders, including men. If sexual violence and tolerance for it is so widespread, we have to understand that we are not contending with individual cases of harm. We are contending with an entire culture of rape and coercion, compliance through intimidation, threat, or force. This culture of rape and coercion is a byproduct of living under the capitalist state, which uses coercion on a daily basis to maintain an economic system rooted in exploitation, oppression, and domination. The terror and trauma of sexual violence is needed to normalize coercion and compliance with all systems of exploitation and oppression, from capitalism and fascism at home to imperialist war abroad. Working jobs that harm our health to keep a roof over our heads, working when we are sick, our children's schools teaching obedience to authority instead of critical thought, a lack of bodily autonomy, from being unable to access clean water and nourishing food to reproductive rights. These are all material conditions that point to a systematic culture of coercion under an economy driven by profit instead of human need. We cannot expect the capitalist state to disrupt violence that it benefits from and needs for its own survival. Non-criminalized community defense and building a culture of consent are proactive steps we can take to fight sexual violence, both in its direct use as a weapon of the capitalist state and as a byproduct of living under the conditions of a culture of coercion and rape. Consent means agreement and participation based on a person's own will, as opposed to being pressured by an external person or force. Transforming our community practices to center a culture of consent and non-criminalized community defense are foundations that we must start building today to disrupt sexual violence and tolerance for it. The role of the capitalist state in protecting sexual violence, not survivors. The trauma of sexual violence plays a critical role in keeping our communities stuck in cycles of disconnection, grief, and chaos. This is one of the many reasons why sexual violence is implicitly encouraged and purposely made difficult to disrupt in our communities under the capitalist culture of rape and coercion. People in positions of authority are often the most common sources of violence, from family members to people who are cornerstones of community institutions. While we are seeing some of the most well-known cultural and spiritual institutions in New Orleans being exposed for rampant sexual violence and trafficking of women and children, the reality is that most of us knew the truth before it hit the headlines. The Catholic Archdiocese of New Orleans, a pinnacle of religious authority in New Orleans that has access to multiple universities, schools, pre-K through high school, and churches in the city, is finally being exposed publicly. What are we collectively prepared to do about it? The response of the capitalist state has been to close ranks and shield abusers and enablers of sexual violence. While lower-level deacons and priests have been named and even served subpoenas, the people in power who helped facilitate and hide decades of sexual abuse, like Gail Benson, the district attorney's office, and even the highest levels of leadership within the Saints and Pelicans have not faced consequences for their actions. It's clear that sexual violence is far more protected than survivors under the capitalist state. People who do try to seek justice through the capitalist state are met with indifference at best or more exposure to trauma and sexual violence. Most sexual violence goes unreported because survivors know the system works harder to protect people who abuse than those who have been abused. Countrywide reports show that only 3% of rapists who are actually convicted spend a single day in jail. In New Orleans, NOPD officers have used their role in the rape kit process more than once to meet women and children to prey upon who have already been victimized. Vicnair case. Even in situations that have nothing to do with sexual violence, interactions with the police, jails, and prisons will make someone 3 times more likely to be a victim of sexual violence. The capitalist state does more to contribute to sexual violence than it does to disrupt it. A non-criminalized approach to organizing to stop sexual violence. So many people want abuse to stop, but understand that involving the capitalist state will only create more, not less problems. There's often concern about getting a loved one in trouble. Then there are those who are directly making a choice to abuse and want to disrupt their own behavior, but will not get help because even getting treatment is tied to criminalization. People often believe that if they don't call the cops, there's nothing that can be done to address the problem. This is one of the many reasons that building a community response to sexual abuse must be non-criminalized. Continued silence, for any reason, only strengthens the practice of sexual abuse. Both the silence and the harm itself must be disrupted. Accountability, not criminalization. Accountability is intentionally not discussed under the conditions of the capitalist state. Learning how to practice accountability offers us the tools to resolve harm without giving up our power to authority figures or believe that criminalization and punishment are the only ways to deal with harm. Accountability is still about facing consequences, but the emphasis is on changed behavior over time, changed behavior of those who cause harm, and changed behavior of communities who are empowered with tools to address harm. So often we are unwilling to draw a line in the sand because we don't believe we have the tools to address what is happening. Accountability still means facing consequences, but those consequences are geared towards ending cycles of violence, not sweeping them under the rug. Accountability processes require a person who caused and/or enables harm to be accountable to those they hurt, the larger community, and ultimately themselves. Practicing accountability allows us to declare in both word and deed that we won't tolerate sexual violence in our communities any longer. If a person does not want to be accountable, our communities can still practice accountability among ourselves and work to disrupt the conditions that provided this person an opportunity to commit sexual violence in the first place and not allow this person to move in community in the same ways they did before the abuse was known. A culture of consent, not capitalist coercion. Consent is often only used in the context of sex, but consent can and should be practiced in all aspects of our lives. There is so little education on how to practice consent in our homes, schools, workplaces, our medical treatment, etc. Because practicing a culture of consent over time will have people questioning exploitation, oppression, and domination in our lives. The capitalist state needs our coercion and compliance to function. Teaching and practicing a culture of consent in our organizing and non-criminalized community defense threatens and weakens the coercive culture of the capitalist state. Sexual violence plays such a crucial role in the capitalist state's arsenal of weapons to keep the masses demoralized, traumatized, paralyzed, and complacent. The good news is that there are already people both locally and globally that are resisting this violence through practicing building a culture of consent and non-criminalized community defense. We are not starting from scratch, but it is our job to accelerate and normalize this critical work.